I'm going to show you the flat square stitch today. It's a really great beginner technique. It's a good bead weaving stitch that is very sturdy, so it's good for beginners. It's also the base of a lot of projects. It can also be the start for various projects. And we're going to be doing some of those projects later on together, so that's why I wanted to make sure that you knew how to do it. So let's take a look at the beads. To start out, I always like to use what I call a stopper bead. And this is just a bead that I temporarily put on my needle and thread, and it's simply used to keep all of the remainder of your beads from falling off the end when you get started. So for your stopper bead, what you'll do is you just pick any random bead that is different than the bead that you're using in your project. You don't want to accidentally get it stitched into your project. So I brought it down to where I had just a little bit of a tail thread below it, and then I brought my needle through the bottom, back up through the top. This leaves a little bit of thread showing right here on the outside edge of the bead, and that's what you want actually, because this is going to come off later. Then you'll pick up the number of beads that you need to make the width of your stitch. In this case, I'm just going to kind of randomly pick up 5 beads, and we'll make a piece that's 5 beads long. I bring those down to my stopper bead. In this particular case, I want to hold the stopper bead so it is away from me, and I'm going to be doing my stitching closest to me. I've got those 5 beads ready to go. I'm going to pick up 1 new bead. This is going to be the first bead of my second row. I'm going to take my needle and pass it through that very first bead closest to me, and I'm bringing that needle towards me, passing through with that needle towards me, and pulling that thread on through. When I do that, you'll notice how that second bead that I just added just popped right next to the first one. So now they're little neighbors together. To get into position to add my next bead, we're going to pass through that bead that I just added. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing. We're going to create neighbors of all of these 5 beads. So I pick up my new bead, pass through the next bead in that initial first row towards myself, pull down, and the new bead just pops into place right next to it. Now you'll notice when I go to pass through this new bead, I'm just going to have this thread sit right along this intersection here. You want to make sure that that thread gets sucked into the spacing there, and that way no thread shows in your project. So you'll keep adding beads that way until you get to the end of your row. So I'm picked up 1 bead, passing through the next bead towards myself, pull it through. Sometimes you have to encourage the new bead to sit nice, and then bring that needle and thread through the new bead that you just added. And we have 2 more to add to the end of this row. Picked up a bead, through the bead in the first row towards myself, bring that thread across, and then pass through the new bead. Our last bead of this row, through the bead towards myself, bring that thread across, back through the new bead, and there you go. Now you have 2 rows. But notice how they're a little wonky. They're not sitting super straight, and that's okay, because here's the second part of square stitch. After you've finished every row, you're going to pass your needle and thread through all the beads of the first row, the previous row. In this case, it's the first row, but if it were multiple rows in, it would just be the previous row. And then bring your needle and thread through all the beads of the row that you just added. Now, as you're doing this, you want to maybe take a look on the back side and make sure that your needle hasn't accidentally popped out. Sometimes this will happen when you try to pass your needle through all those beads, and you end up with a little piece of needle showing, and once you pull your thread through, that would be thread. So just take a little moment to look and make sure that you have your needle through all the beads. And there we go. So now this is going to help straighten those rows up. It also really strengthens your piece. Then to start your next row, I like to always work in the same direction. So I just flip the piece so that now my thread is coming out the bottom again and I'm ready to start the next row. And you would do it just exactly the same way. And this time it's going to be a little easier because those beads are all solid, they're not loose on the thread. And so as you pick up a bead, pass through the first bead closest to you. Make him sit the way he should, no naughty beads. And then pass through the one that you just added. And you will just continue doing this over and over until you reach the length that you desire. I like to put my finger over where I'm pulling the bead. When I'm pulling the thread, I like to put my finger over that intersection. It keeps the beads from pulling out of alignment if your thread happens to catch on something. So that's the basics of square stitch. And next up, I'm going to show you how to add an end thread in square stitch. As with almost any bead weaving project, you're going to have to add thread at some point. It's none of our favorite thing to do, but the good news about square stitch is that it's actually a very simple thing to do when you're working with square stitch. So let's take a look. What I have here is I've completed a number of rows. We've got 5 rows of square stitch here, and you can see that my length of thread is getting kind of short. You don't want to leave you don't want to keep going until your thread gets super short because you do have to weave this back in. So somewhere when it's about 4 to 6 inches long, that's the point at which I want to switch out my threads. If you're a beginner, I always suggest that you start your new thread before you end off your old thread. And the reason for that is you can make sure that you're coming out of the same bead that you are working on right now when you add your new thread in. This seems like it would be easier to remember which bead you're coming out of and in what direction than it really is. And I have gotten myself messed up many times because I ended off the old thread first and then couldn't remember where I needed to be. So what I'm going to do here is leave this thread attached, and I've already cut off a length of new thread here. This happens to be a fairly short length of thread, but your directions in your project will normally say how much thread you should work with. If it doesn't, I just suggest a comfortable length of thread. And for different people, that means different things. If you get super long with your thread, then you're going to have more tangles, so don't go crazy. So I know that I want my new thread to come out here. So I'm just going to kind of randomly pick a spot a couple of rows back and pass through a couple of beads. Doesn't matter whether it's 2 beads, 3 beads, this is not rocket science. I need to leave myself a little tail here so that I can hold on to that tail while I'm securing it. We'll cut that off later. And then I'm just going to weave back and forth through these beads and change directions a couple times. What I want to do is make sure that my thread sits in these bead intersections and that no thread is showing. So here I'm going to pass through the next 2 beads and I'm changing direction. It's always good to also go back through beads you've already been through. So here I am changing direction. I went through 4 this time. I'll come back, change directions yet again, come back through, let's say 3. And now I can work my thread so it's coming out that same location. Oops, missed 1 bead there. It's coming out the same location where the old thread is. So the new thread's all ready to work with. I'm just going to snip off this little tail that I used to hold on to. You just want to snip it nice and close to the beads. Then for your old thread, get that, you're going to finish it off the exact same way. And you're just going to pass it through a couple of beads, making sure that nothing's showing on the outside of any of these beads. Pass through another couple of beads on the next row over, back through. Oop, didn't even catch the beads that time. There we go. And then I'll just do 1 more direction. I like to change directions at least 2 or 3 times, and if there's enough room in your beads to get back through, 4 times is even better. pull the needle off the thread, and then I'm just ready to clip that old tail. And there we go. Now I have the new thread attached and the old thread is gone. I'll flip it so that I have the thread coming out the bottom, and I'm ready to start again. So working with adding and ending thread in square stitch is really easy. Don't let it intimidate you. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I had a really good time and I hope you did too. I love to see the projects that you guys come up with, so you can find me on Facebook at jillwisemandesigns.com. Be sure to subscribe to and like the channel so that you can keep up with all of the goodies that I've got coming down the road. So many projects and tips and techniques for you, interviews, behind the scene kind of stuff at the bead shows. And you can also find a link to my website below where you'll find kits and patterns and all sorts of beady goodness for you to enjoy. Thank you.